It's 6:33, and I just wanted to get us started. I want to first thank Dr. Hal Grodevant from the Rudd Family Foundation Chair of the UMass Amherst Adoption Research Program for all of the resources to have our conference, which was supposed to be in person in April of 2020, continue to happen in a very creative format, which has been these virtual conferences. I also really wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Jen Dolan, who's the program manager of the Rudd Adoption Research Program, and Amanda Moore, our events and communications manager, who's handled all of these technological details of moving this conference virtually. So welcome and thank you. My name again is Dr. Holly McGinnis, and I am an assistant professor at VCU School of Social Work. And I have the honor of being invited to be the first inaugural program chair of the 2020 Rudd Adoption Research Program Conference, which then has become a 2-year commitment as we really thought about how we could still hold a conference during the pandemic. And so the conference is still focused on adopted adults' connections across generations, which I was so excited for because there has not been a lot of attention, though we have as professionals often talked about adoption being lifelong, a conference that was solely focused on adulthood for adoptees and foster care alumni. And as an adopted person myself from South Korea, raised in a transracial adoptive family, this was very, very near and dear to my heart personally, as well as scholarly. So as we reimagined and reinvented this conference from its original in-person format, we did 3 sessions in the fall where we tested the waters, and we heard your feedback saying you wanted to have a live session where you could actually interact with our speakers. So I'm so happy to say that's what we're doing, and that is part of the experiment of tonight, and we're so glad that you all are here. So the theme of this first session, and we'll be having 2 more sessions for the spring, really is kicked off by Dr. Gina Samuels' keynote tonight, which is authorizing our own pathways and counterspaces of healing, resilience, and resistance. So the purpose that we would like this session to really focus on is about really engaging in a discussion about how persons who have experienced adoption and foster care move into adulthood and continue to do the work of making meaning of those experiences. There aren't many resources in adulthood. We have typically focused more on childhood or adolescence or young adulthood and not later adulthood. And so I'm so thrilled to have other speakers as well who will be talking about how in adulthood, they have worked to figure out their own processes of authorizing their own healing and resilience. So it's my hope that in listening to and engaging in this conversation, we will begin to see how adoption and foster care in childhood continues into adulthood and begin to really shift the lens on how we help young people from the perspective of them as grown-ups. So that is, how can we give children and youth what they need now that they will need when they are grown up so that they can be set up for thriving adulthoods. So the format for tonight, it is being recorded. And so the recorded version of this will be posted on the Rudd virtual conference website. So you'll be able to watch it as many times as you would like. We are going to start off with Dr. Samuels' presentation, and to help us start to think about what do we mean about authorizing pathways of healing, resilience, and resistance, and some of the challenges with having to do that, especially on your own. And then I'm going to invite Tim Monti-Wohlpart and April Curtis Rivera, to join the conversation and talk about their personal experiences authorizing their own pathways to healing and resilience as adults. We will then end up with questions for about 15-20 minutes with our audience. So I invite you to put your questions as they pop into your mind in the Q&A and not in the chat, please. So the Q&A is where we'll be pulling those questions. And we'll talk for about 60 minutes and then we'll have the Q&A. Okay. So let me first briefly introduce our speakers tonight. Dr. Gina Samuels is an associate professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. She's also a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Her scholarship explores processes of identity, belonging, relational impermanence, and permanence, ambiguous loss, and the effects of chronic displacement from one's experience of family and home among youth and young adults with histories of foster care, homelessness, and transracial adoption. Prior to her academic career, Dr. Miranda Samuels was a child welfare caseworker, a juvenile probation agent, and also a clinician with youth under court supervision for violent offenses. She's also an adopted adult. Tim Monti-Wohlpart is a New York-born adoptee in reunion since 1998. He is the National Legislative Chair of the American Adoption Congress, AAC, and the creator of the grassroots citizens petition to enact the Clean Adoption Reform Law. In 2002 and 2003, he served as a vice president and legislative liaison of New York statewide adoption reform. At that time, he lobbied for unrestricted original birth certificate access for adult adoptees. In 2015, he began a grassroots effort to restore, advance, and enact the unrestricted access bill after it was changed in June 2015. His public petition supporting that effort was provided to key legislators and Governor Cuomo of New York State and the Department of Health, and got passed, by the way. He holds a BS in marketing with a minor in political science and a master's of education, and he currently lives in Brooklyn. So thanks for coming in from Brooklyn. April Curtis Rivera is an alumnus of the Illinois child welfare system. She has utilized her lived experience to serve as a national consultant for the past 20 years, including a founding member of the Foster Care Alumni of America, CWLA Board of Directors and Fellow, and as a consultant to the director of DCFS in transforming the Illinois child welfare system, juvenile justice system, and mental health system. She also helped to change legislation on sibling rights for foster and adoptive youth, and she has presented and trained both youth and adults in child welfare communities on various topics, and also has participated as and coordinated the CWLA annual national conferences and alumni powerhouse conferences, which is a conference geared toward bringing youth and alum of the child welfare system together. April is a graduate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and continues to be a diligent advocate leader, working to help youth and families in her community solve problems, advocate for themselves, and improve their lives. She currently lives in Chicago and is Chief Strategy Officer for Aspira National. With that, I now pass the mic over to Gina to tell us about her work and authorizing our pathways. Thanks, Gina. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Holly. Well, it's an honor to be here with you all this evening and to share this space with my esteemed co-panelists. So I think we're up for a really exciting conversation. The reason why I chose this title is that as I've sort of unfolded my own career, I'm always struck by the ways in which those of us who have lived expertise, who also practice in this area as professionals, are oftentimes questioned about our own perspectives, even when we're presenting data. And so I've gotten to a place, so this is a little bit of Gina's obstinance, this title, but it also is an invitation to those of you who are listening who may have your own personal connections and stories around adoption, to invite you along with me to author and authorize your own pathways. And so before I even get started, I just want to honor that there are so many different stories of adoption. There's so many different ways in which we can find ourselves having that as a history and a part of our own personal story or our larger family story. And so I just want to remind us to hold that that's okay, and that even my panelists may say things that are different, and that's okay too. The part of authorizing our own pathways means that we speak with polyphonic voices, more than one voice, that people can decide that searching is important, and other people can decide that it's not. People can decide that adoption was central to their lives, and other people can decide that it's not. And all of that has got to be okay. And so I just want to say that at the start. Most of what I'm going to be talking about oftentimes is most poignantly true for those of us who also are transracially adopted. But I want to challenge us all to think about the ways in which these issues are also shared among people who aren't adopted and may have similar pathways of not knowing, similar pathways of feeling that they can't author their own stories. And so we're going to try to hold all of this complexity as I move through the next, 14 minutes of my talk. So I wanted to start, as I oftentimes do in my classes with my students, with a quote that sort of grounds my point. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about is, how do we story? How do we author? How do we get the information that we need to be able to do that? How do we make meaning? And so Maya Angelou's quote I thought was appropriate for this evening. And she says, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." But I think for many of us, there's also the agony of sensing that there's more to your story and more to you than is known by you or by others, or seen or acknowledged. So it's also that piece of, what is it like to both hold a story that you feel you don't have a space to tell, and to know that there is a part of your story that you may not even know. So I don't even know how long ago this was, maybe 10 years ago now. I was invited by my cousin, who is an information library scientist. Yes, that is a thing. To talk about transracial adoption. And when I was invited to go there and do that, he teaches at College Park in Maryland. And when he invited me, I was like, "Paul, there's no connection here. I don't know why I'll come over and see you and Aunt Marianne for dinner or something, but why would library scientists be interested in transracial adoption?" But as I started reading, I actually discovered a word that has become very critical to anchor a lot of what I do think happens in adulthood for many of us whose childhoods oftentimes are lacking really critical information about our own stories. And that's the term information poverty. And in library science, they use it for all kinds of other things, which we will not get into. But for our conversation today, I have sort of put together a definition that I'd like you to, as I'm reading it, think about the connections and relevance that it has for adoption, and for those of us who, especially those of us who grow up with very limited information about our own backgrounds. So information poverty is a situation in which individuals and communities within a given context do not have or are denied the requisite means and abilities to obtain efficient access to essential information, to interpret it and apply it to their well-being, their safety, and their health. It can be characterized by an information infrastructure that is poorly developed, fully absent, or intentionally prohibits one's access. And so I'm just going to leave you with that definition to think about it. I know my co-panelists have probably some things to say about that, but it is in that context that the rest of the slides that I'm going to show you are sort of anchored in. So sort of ask this question: what is that like to reach your adulthood lacking some very basic information that other people take for granted and would argue it's really not that important, but that when you don't have it, it can take on these huge mammoth meanings for you across your lifetime, so that at some stages of your life, it may really not be important. Maybe when you're the little kid, squeezing, loving, harming, I don't know, the cat down there, it's not that important at all. And maybe it's not important till you get much later on in your life, and all of a sudden it becomes really, really important that you don't have this piece of information. And so I want us to sort of hold this. What is this like to go through the same stages that everybody else goes through, and the same life decisions and challenges and losses and joys, but without very core pieces of your information that oftentimes you have to make a very deliberate and conscious choice and effort to go get, oftentimes within an infrastructure that is not set up for you to easily get it, right? So I want us to think about this as a social justice issue for those of us who are adopted or are touched by adoption, and that this lack of information is oftentimes things that we should be thinking about. What is the right that all of us have to basic information about ourselves as citizens to be able to operate and fully access the benefits of citizenry that we should be having in this nation? And what also happens, so before I talk a little bit about some of the domains in adulthood that I think we navigate as adults and the identity work that we do, is that what happens when you don't have your own information, and that is that it often centers the knowledge and best interests of those who have the most power to give you the information, right? And this holds us vulnerable to all kinds of stories, other people's stories about us, right? That we then oftentimes internalize, because those are the stories we're told, right? So all of you, I'm not going to go over these in depth because I'm guessing I'm talking to an audience of people who have probably heard some of these things, but I just want to have them have space on a slide so that we can sort of take them in for a minute. So there's a whole host of stories that are about how you came to be a part of a family, that are chosen narratives, oftentimes narratives of being chosen, narratives that you should be grateful or lucky, or narratives that are also classist and tell you, oh, how lucky you are that you didn't get to grow up in family X, and that's a very classist way to assume that somehow life is horrible based on class status only. Right? Many of these stories are racist and colonialist. They operate off of ontologies of ownership or white supremacy. Right? Many of these stories and knowledge dismiss and marginalize and silence and tokenize all kinds of aspects of us and how we show up. There's the angry adoptee trope. So when we find out information that we should have found out before and we get a little pissed off about it, we get dismissed as the angry adoptee, and then you get uninvited to all things adoptee, right? Or you get infantilized. John Ribel talked quite a bit about this, and I think any of us who have been on the adoption circuit or on a panel or anything and been asked a question that then we answer, and then we're told, oh, but it's not really, it's more complicated than that, right? So it's another way in which other people's knowledge is sort of supplants our own knowledge. Dismissing or marginalizing birth families, nations of origin, minoritized racial and ethnic cultures, and diminishing them as less important to our story. Or having stories that are race evasive and sort of center whiteness as supremacist, understanding multiraciality this way, understanding what it's like to be in a mixed race family as a rainbow family, right? And think of others. There are many. These are just a sampling. And not having access to knowledge can affect every single domain of basic development that we know is critical for healthy children and healthy adults. Right? It can affect your identity, your sense of self, your sense of belonging, your ability to trust and feel secure, to feel a sense of connection, the ways in which you make meaning of things that happen in your life and have happened in your life, and your sense of having agency and power and control, knowing that there's some stranger out there that might know more about how you came into this world than you do. That's really a weird kind of place to be in. It's still weird. So I thought it might be easy if we talked about identity work in terms of buckets. Could have used the metaphor of vessels or something more elegant, but today I like buckets. So I'd like to talk about, for the time that I have left, some of the questions that come up in terms of knowledge in adulthood, some of the questions that come up in terms of meanings and making meaning of things, and then also this third bucket that I want to call counterspaces and connections. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term counterspaces, it really just is a way of thinking about what it's like to be in a minoritized body or have an identity that is somehow oppressed or stigmatized, and to be living in the world in a space like that, that the counterspace is something outside of that. The counter space is a space for transformation, for healing, for safety, for protection, to be in community with people who share an identity, where you can try on other identities, where you can learn from elders. It sort of holds silent the outside world for a temporary moment. And that it means counter, right? So counter space. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's what that means. So knowledge. These are just some of the questions that I'd like us to think about, and I'm happy to talk more about them when we have time for questions, but I just want to sort of put them out there as possible discussion points. So the first is sort of thinking through as adults, what and whose stories, events, histories, conditions are most relevant to me. I think many of us in adulthood get to a place where like, wait a minute, whose story is that? And do I like that anymore? Does this serve me anymore? Is there information that I need to have that I don't? And who are the bearers of this knowledge? Where would I go to get it? I think a third question that many of us have to come to terms with as people who have existed within foster care, adoption, is reconciling not knowing, reconciling lost information, the uncertainty of information. When I've interviewed people who have adoption histories, many times when I ask them about, okay, tell me about your story, they'll say, well, from what I know, which is such a poignant way to start a story. From what I know, it engenders such ambiguity and uncertainty, right, about the trustworthiness of the information that we even have. And reconciling old information with new information. What are we going to do as we learn new information? How do we revisit what we used to know, how we used to know it? I think the fourth piece of knowledge and one of the sort of identity tests and questions is what having information actually changes, what it does and doesn't solve, what it can and can't solve. I think many of us who have been through a search imagine that something magical is going to happen at the end of that. And sometimes it does. And other times you just have more information. And so reconciling and figuring out what having this information changes, what you want it to change, what you don't, and you getting to decide that. And then affirming and building your own capacities for holding this knowledge and deciding its importance in your life or not, and that you get to decide that, and someone else doesn't get to decide that. So knowledge, lots of other domains, but those are some of them that I think we go through as adults. So the second bucket is meaning. So once you get all this information, what do you do with it? So it's a cartoon with a lemon in therapy with his, I guess it's a pineapple therapist, saying everybody tries to make me into lemonade, but I just can't be something I'm not, right? So as we get older, we start to realize that we have these stories that we're carrying around with us. And how are they serving us? Whose stories? Whose definitions and meanings are you living? And are they working for you? Are they not? And that doesn't mean that you throw out every meaning that you were told before and you get new ones, but to really reconcile with what are the systems of meaning that I really do want to carry with me. And oftentimes, many of us realize that we've internalized a lot of dominant narratives in our society that are very pathologizing about our families, about our own heritages, about our biological families, about our adoption, et cetera. And so it really is this process oftentimes of figuring out how to decenter whiteness from our stories, how to decenter monocentricity, meaning that you can only be in one family at a time, that you can only be one race at a time, biologism, and the value of having biological connections as opposed to other ways of being in relation with people. And all of these are really dominant narratives in our society with a lot of baggage and a lot of politic and a lot of weight. And so we have to decide in our adulthoods what value we want to give to those kinds of narratives and those kinds of meanings as adopted persons. And do your systems of meaning serve your identity, your well-being, your growth, your healing, and capacity for resilience as an adult? So what allowed us to make meaning and survive our childhoods or just enjoy our childhoods. It doesn't have to be quite so dire, but to make it through our childhoods, the systems of meaning and the ways in which we had to get through that may not serve us as adults. And so how do we expose ourselves to new knowledge and also new meanings so that we can be the authors of our own healing and resistance, and also resistance, right, to some of the more stigmatizing and pathologizing narratives that exist. And then finally, what I was talking about before in terms of counterspaces and connections. So much of, at least the adopted persons I am in relationship with, our adulthoods, and especially our early adulthoods, are filled with what I want to call placemaking. Right. So family building and figuring out, am I still going to be in relation to my racist Uncle Joe? You know, like, well, do I have to do that? Am I going to go to these family reunions that are spaces of harm? Or do I want to go to those family reunions that aren't spaces of harm that I actually love, but now my new friend group doesn't understand why I want to hang around with these white people that I'm in relationship with? And so how do we make these decisions about people that we're in relationship to as part of our family and have that be a choice that we're making? Some of us are nerds and we get PhDs and we create research and knowledge about adoption and language that is more honoring of our own authoring and authorizing. Lifelong identity work. I'm older now, a lot older now, and I'm realizing it just never ends. It never ends. Just when I'm thinking I've got all my placemaking done, done my search, done the DNA testing, I've done all my family building, something happens and I am not necessarily back to square one, but I am recycling through some very early and basic questions again and recalibrating counterspaces and connections so that I can maintain my wellness, right? Creating community. What does it mean to have particularly grown up as a Black person who's also mixed race with a white family, right? How do I create community and honor all of these dimensions of myself? And how do I get to choose that and change my mind over the course of my life? And then thickening and complicating and enriching our stories, that I think that's so much part of lifelong identity work that I hope I can invite you all to consider, that this isn't a one and done thing, and that life gives us all kinds of new opportunities to revisit what we know, to revisit the meanings that we've attached, and to change and to calibrate and grow along with that. Right? And making sure that we have access to the people and the places and the information, the relationships and the experiences and the systems that are maximally relevant to fostering your growth and healing and connection and full potential. So, like that commercial, what's in your bucket? What are the buckets that maybe you filled up? And what are the buckets that you still need to grow in? And I'll end with a quote, an African proverb that reminds us of the importance of who tells the story. So until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And with that, I will close and turn the baton over to one of my co-panelists.
Gina, if you could unshare.
Yep.
Working on that.
Yeah.
Wow. I love it. You gave us so many things to munch on. And what I'd love to do now is invite Tim and April to, step in with your own stories. I had specifically invited both of you because of the agency, power, control, advocacy work that you had done. And I think that often we don't, we think like, oh, that's just what some people do, when they grow up. But my question or invitation was like, really, how is the work that you've been doing not only changing out there, but also changed you within and has become part of the way you have authored and make meaning about the experiences you have had. So Tim, would you like to share your story first, and then April, and then let's just talk about it and respond to Gina's ideas and presentations. But I want you first to just tell us your story, and then we'll begin the dialogue.
Absolutely. First off, Holly, thank you so much. Gina, tremendous. I want to thank everybody at the Rudd Adoption Research Program for having this event. Really honored to be here. Gina, what a great presentation. I was taking copious notes. As someone who's been a student for a long time in my life, I'm assuming there could be a quiz, and I'm really hoping I'll pass. No, this is a great, I mean, as an activist, it's really great to listen to you talk, because you talk about information poverty, for example, and you talk about access to information, efficient access to information. And it's just fun to have my advocate brain taking all this in and thinking, oh, well, that's like with the court process, and how in certain states, a lot of states where access is still denied to the original birth certificate for adult adoptees, there's always been a mechanism to unseal the birth record for good cause shown to the court. But please don't construe that as a likelihood of success of those petitions, because very often good cause doesn't go anywhere. So having the practical application of those ideas just running through my head really gives me a strong sense of just how pertinent and real and timeless and important everything that you said, every single word that you said really is. So thank you, Gina, for that. So in terms of me, Holly, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm a New York adopted person. I was born in Westchester County and adopted right there. I know, Holly, you and I have a little bit of a connection to Westchester, and I lived the first 3 years of my life in Briarcliff Manor. And when I was young, about 3 or so, we moved to Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is. And kids, used to ask me what I was. What are you? Are you white? Are you black? What are you? And you don't look like any of those people that you say are your family. Or so if I had wanted, in the unlikely event that I had wanted to forget that I was adopted, the world certainly wasn't interested in having me do that. And so in terms of beginning to assimilate that experience, I think for myself over the years, it really felt as though I didn't feel a sense of belonging really anywhere. And I didn't really know why that was. I think it might seem like it was obvious why that was, that I was adopted. But it wasn't until I really understood that the circumstance of surrender and the reality of losing a family before gaining a family had its own circumstance and manifestation, in such that there can be a fear of abandonment. So when I was able to really put that construct together in my own mind, I was able to really get a solid sense and begin to get my hands around a process of trying to own the manifestations of those two circumstances in the context of being an adopted person. I was never going to search. I felt that I knew everything I needed to know. If I had ever been found, I might have been cordial about all that. But in the mid-90s, I had a little bit of a medical scare after I had graduated from Arizona State and begun my career in the prior career in the advertising agency business. And I went to the doctor as a follow-up. And he said, "Tim, I need your medical history." And I said, "I don't have it." He said, "Well, you need to get it." I said, "I was adopted." He said, "Oh, then don't worry about it." I thought, okay, well, that's a curious thing. I think it was not until I was out in the parking lot and maybe back home in my apartment that I began the wheels started to turn. How is it that it was so important to have this information until I was adopted? And I realized it was almost a cultural knee-jerk reaction that if you were adopted, that meant you didn't need to know about yourself. And something started to turn in my mind about, I had just had a life-threatening experience. I want everyone to know I am okay. And at the time, I was a little frightened. So I began to look into my medical history. I wrote to the Westchester County Department of Social Services. And I told them that I'd really like to get any information they could give me about my medical history. And please do not tell me, I'm not asking you for the names of my birth parents. At the time, I was so naive. I thought that if I didn't tell them not to tell me the names of my birth parents, that they would be enthusiastic to do so. Yeah, no. So I was learning, and not only did they not have the latitude to tell me the identifying information, the names, therefore, of my birth parents, they were not super excited to give me the non-identifying information that I actually had a legal right to. Now, I'm a persistent person as an advocate. And back then I was advocating just for myself, and I kept going for 6 months. And finally, after 6 months, the director of social services at the time said, I'm not certain why this is so important to you. And I said, well, if it's not evident by now, it may never be. But suffice it to say, I'm probably never going to leave you be until you send me this non-identifying information. So she did. I was very happy to get it. And I got information, and I called her and I said, thank you. And I asked her why she just didn't provide it 6 months earlier when I first asked. And she said, and I believe I'm quoting directly here, because I didn't want to tell you anything that might have inspired you to search for your natural mother, unquote. And I said, well, with all due respect, what difference would it make to you if I make the personal decision to search for my birth mother? And her answer to that was nothing, conversation over. So I recognized by that point that this was way bigger than my non-identifying information. From the time that I began my inquiry into the non-ID and the medical history information, which I did get some, very dated, incorrect, and incomplete. I later found out from my birth mother that information was not accurate in terms of its timing. And I'll get to that in a second. I realized this was a central matter to my entire being of a person, to understand who I was, to understand what I was, to really reconcile the circumstances of surrender and adoption. As I've said before, I think sometimes if we had been called surrenderees instead of adoptees, that tendency for people, as Gina said a minute ago, to take on that narrative of rescue narrative that you were grateful, you were lucky, you were picked, you were chosen. Yes, you're talking about adoption, and our experiences of adoption can be wonderful, but no matter how wonderful our experience of adoption may be, we have a deficit in terms of not knowing our origins. So it's not predicated on the positiveness or not of that. So I searched for 2 years, found my birth mother. I've been in reunion for 23 years. I have 2 siblings on that side. They're really great, brother and sister. And not long after that, I moved to New York and began to work as an advocate, because I realized after Oregon, and we got to do this elsewhere. We've got to restore unrestricted access to original birth certificates for all adult adopted persons, and that's what we've been working on. So so that's kind of a little summary of my story. And if we come back around, Holly, I don't know if you wanted me to comment now about the experience of how being an advocate has affected my experience of adoption. Should I do that now, or should I do that?
No, let's take a pause and move over to April, and then we'll reflect on all of the work that we've been doing, and Gina also, because you've been doing a lot of that.
I had a feeling that would be a good stopping point.
Great. April.
Absolutely. So I will say, first of all, thank you and good evening. Thank you for inviting me, Holly. At first, I was questioning why you even invited me. It was like, adoption? I wasn't adopted, but it is, however, it's embedded and woven into the fabric of my story. I have experienced in 18 years while I was in child welfare system, separation, adoption, and reunification. And it's really important that I bring those up because I'm one of 4 siblings. And we all dealt with the child welfare system at different levels. And as I sit here, I can recall the years of fighting to see my mom, my dad, and most importantly, my siblings. Hearing from my colleagues today, I do not regret fighting to stay in their lives. I do not regret making sure that my sister understood who is the baby of us, who was adopted, who her family was, and who they are today. You know, when she turned 18, she came home. And had I not fought for us to stay in each other's lives, she wouldn't have a home to come home to. And she would be trying to do the adoption search. She would be trying to find out, who are we, where are we, and where do we come from? When I heard my Tim talk about medical, that's the most important thing I think about. I can call and try to unpack what my medical history was for my family. I never wanted my sister to question what that was like. I never wanted her to question, did we leave her? Did we give up on her? Those were the things that ran through my mind as a teenager and a young adult in college, which is why I was able to just find this inner fight to fight. And that's what pushed with the legislation of, when you leave the child welfare system in Illinois or a sibling is adopted, being able to still have the ability to reconnect with your siblings. I will say, honestly, adoption was a taboo until I became a young adult. I hated the word adoption because through the eyes of my young people like myself, who our siblings were being adopted and we weren't. And in my case, we were older siblings, and then we had a younger sibling that returned home to his father. So my older brother and I were just too old to be adopted. We had at that time had spent several years in care, and we were between relatives and non-relatives. My sister was the baby, and so she was more adoptable. She was biracial, and she fit the whole stereotype. I really hate to say that, but that's the realities of it. We didn't, right? We came with preconceived notions of who our family was and who we were, and we were going to question that. And so the biggest misperception is that as a teenager, I was constantly told, this is a good thing. Your sister's getting adopted. She's going to have a permanent family, a permanent home. And everything was, all these big words were being thrown out. And here we were trying to figure out, what does that mean for us permanently? Right? What does that mean? A piece of paper is going to now tell me that my sister is permanently not my sister. And I really think that when we're talking about the adoption process and when siblings are included, we don't process all those things. We don't think all those things. You don't think them through. We want to make sure that we're finding permanency or in the best interest of a child, and we forget about the whole siblings. We forget about the whole family. My sister didn't come into foster care by herself. She came into foster care with siblings. And that became part of our fight and our story. For my sister, she too gets the questions, Tim, well, who are you? What are you? What's your identity? And where's your background? Your name is this, and you started off with a last name Evans, and now you're a Marrero, and really just depends on who you come across. And I knew then as a teenager, I wasn't the only one going through this. And I was on the youth advisory board and was what I remember an old worker referred to me as a sassafras, that I just didn't take no for an answer. And I continue to fight and say, well, this doesn't sound right. What do you mean I can't see my sister after she's been adopted? She's my sister. She exists to me. She knows who we are and we know who she is. And so we went through years of, while we were fighting the adoption process, of really saying, when we had visits, here's a picture of us on the old Polaroids. Here's the address of Granny's house. Here's the address of such and such house. When you get older, you come find us. Here's our names. And it was almost trying to instill to a 9-year-old at that time that she had family. But it wasn't until she was actually fully adopted, and we had the opportunity, my sister and I, to do a story together on our adoption experience. And when the interview asked her, and at that time I was still opposed to adoption, even with me being able to go see her, when the interview asked her, what do you like most about being adopted? She simply, genuinely answered, I have more family. So I had to look at it through her eyes and her perspective. It clicked for me. It changed for me. I went many years fighting against adoption and what it meant for me through my eyes and my brother's eyes. But hearing from my sister at that time, it really meant that we need to be fighting about family. And if an adoption is in the result of family, or we can have both, the best of both worlds, without losing who you are, your cultural identity, your sense of belonging, your what does it mean to comb your hair a certain way? What does it mean to eat the certain foods that you're supposed to be growing up with, and those things? Then let's move forward with that story. Holly, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it back to allow you to give those. I hope it gave enough teaser for more questions.
Yes, we have some great ones coming Q&A, so we're going to have a nice, lively conversation. Gina, I just wanted to roll it back to you, thinking about kind of comments that Tim and April said, and about, again, that information poverty and everything, and any other points.
Yes, yes, and amen. I mean, I think
Session closed.
Yeah, drop the mic, April. I think, I think both Tim and April raised some of the really core concerns that, in terms of how the adults involved oftentimes muck it up, for us to be able to think complexly about what should adoption mean? What does it not need to mean? And how threatened everybody gets in trying to control our access to really critical relationships that should not be looked at as anything other than critical relationships for us to have going forward and throughout our lifetimes, throughout our lifetimes. And so I think, I hear all that Tim and April are saying, and I just think, how long is it going to take for us to develop systems that are actually systems of care and take the perspectives of those of us who have been through it to think about what are the ways in which we engage human beings and restructure families so that they can be flexible, like how most everybody else lives their families. Like other people live families in these complex ways. But it's somehow when we start developing our systems that we get really rigid and wonky about who can see who and why you can't see your health information. And then all of a sudden, when we learn you're adopted, then you don't need to know if or you have to pay $500 to get a genetic test to learn that you carry the BRCA gene for cancer or something. I mean, it's just, so yeah. So I guess I really would hope that all of these stories, which are really as unique as they are, they're actually not unique, that there's just a million people who have various iterations of these kinds of circumstances and frustrations. And it just seems like, wow, we're in the 21st century and still trying to figure out how to be in family with one another and allow people to do that in ways that are helpful, healing, and growth fostering.
Yeah. And I think that I think a lot of the adults who have become advocates, who have lived experiences, what we've come to see is that it is the system, the way that we have designed it to cut people off rather than add them more.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's not our parents. It's not all, those, I mean, we have some of that too, in the sense of that we as the people in the systems, right, are imprinted with the certain messages about how it should be, right? And maybe not too much up here and not in here. And that, so then we need to say, if information is so vital, why are we making it so scary? And then how can we bring some of those down? I was hoping that Gina, Tim, and April could now talk a little bit more about, Gina, I kind of think of you as have taken the path of knowledge, the bucket, right? As a researcher scholar. And Tim, you have, in some ways, a path of meaning making, right? So get that information and you can make meaning. And then April, your work has been around creating counter spaces. And so I was hoping that you could just talk a little bit about those and how that has also evolved your stories. Because I remember hearing a lot from adoptive parents saying like, okay, well, what should I tell them about their adoption? And what I realized is that it's kind of like a snake having to molt its skin. Like we constantly need to shed the old story and bring in more information as we become more and more older. And so, I think another question that I'll have for all of you is, what is the story that kids need to know so that they can grow into their full self right? Because I think there is more information we can tell children. We're very hypersensitive to kids, but kids actually know a lot, even if they're not told. And that is, from my truth, from when I look at my kids, all of the clinical work with, I'm like, the kids always knew what was going down, even if they weren't being told. So that would be the other part. So Gina, knowledge bucket. How did you get there? And how did that become your pathway of authorizing?
I don't know how that, I'm an accidental academic. I don't know how I really got there, but that's a different story. I think, I think a lot of things like, I'm really stuck on, Holly, what you just said about, the kids already know, and these adults are running around kind of like, and I think that's part of the problem, that the adults need to work on their own stuff. And that oftentimes, like I think about, so in my story, race was blank. So Tim, I got a lot of like, what are you kind of thing. But I just had to decide I was Black because there was nothing on my birth certificate. It was blank. And so I just decided I'm going to be Black. My sister's Black, we're Black, we match, that'll work, And so that's sort of how I went through my life. And my mom was otherwise always very open with me about information. Just totally, we talked about race, we talked about very open. But this blank on my birth certificate, not so much. So it caused all kinds of fantasy things about who my birth mother was, how my birth mother could have not known, like. Like as I'm learning knowledge about how babies are created, I'm thinking, well, like, what are the ways in which you would have a baby and you would not know the father? So, that kind of left only a couple options for me. And so by the time I was a teenager, my mom had still not gotten around to telling me that in my case files, the information was that my birth mother was raped, which I later learned was not true. But at the time, she had so much stuff around like what I was going to think of my birth father, like when could she tell me? And so she held this for a really, really long time, a ridiculously long time. Like I was 17 and I was watching Oprah, and I was from Chicago. So I was like, April was in DCFS and foster care and adopted through that way. And Oprah had women of the night, as they were called then. And one woman said, well, I had this kid out of, being a sex worker, and I named her Gina and gave her up for adoption. And I'm like, that's my birth mother. Right. And so I call my mother at work and I tell her I found her, and my mom's like, okay, I guess I need to tell you now. But, I think that parents sometimes make these things into a big fantastical situations that kids have already figured out, maybe worse, what's happening. And I think part of my own journey of wanting to be really more a teacher is just how important information is and how much we can trust each other with it. And oftentimes we don't trust each other with it. And sometimes the fancy truth and just telling people the truth, people can hold it a lot better than we think that they can. And it's more about our own stuff and the meaning that we have made of that knowledge than it is about the other person. And it's a very arrogant thing to keep information, to decide for someone else that they can't handle it because you can't.
Mm-hmm. So powerful. And it also makes me, think about how, as you said, that ended up not being the story, and so your mom was holding this, secret, for 17 years that ended up not actually being true. And so what does it take for us to be vulnerable to say, I don't know, this is
right
on paper, but I don't actually know, honey.
Who knows?
Because we never got to talk to that lady, your mom.
Yeah.
And how freeing that could be if we could actually tell our kids, I don't know.
Everything isn't certain.
And everything is not certain. And then be with our children in the uncertainty rather than holding it back as though they couldn't take the uncertainty, although they're sitting in the uncertainty already.
Already.
Yeah, great. Tim, do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, when it comes to meanings, the meanings area, one of the fastest ways I think I can convey one of the important thoughts on this is to reference one of my great friends and fellow advocates from Texas, Shauna Hodgson, who's helping to lead our efforts down there. She says it very plainly: people are not secrets. I don't know how to be much more efficient than that. But because I'm a verbose individual, I'm going to keep going. And Sean is probably laughing right now. But here's what I'll say to you. You know, as I think Gina alludes to, and I want to say this as well, is, or she infers, is what I've noticed with this is that with a lot of things, including especially here, there's preconceived notions that lead to a cultural understanding that is in error and off its ballast, and which lead then to legislative or policies, decisions that are made that are not in comportment with reality. I'll give you one example. Okay. You look at some old articles on this issue. All right. The issue of adopted persons having access to their information. And you see articles that say there's a bill in the legislature, the state legislature, that will allow adopted kids to search for their birth parents. Well, it was never against the law to search for your birth parent. We're not kids, we're adults. And this goes to the infantilization that Gina speaks to, and the rampant preconceived notions that extend to the idea that the genesis of sealing original birth certificates had to do with protecting the confidentiality and privacy of birth parents. 1,000,000% not true. It had nothing to do with that. There were at times from social work practitioners, and I think Gina's going to love what I'm about to say, there were at times conversations about confidentiality and privacy that were ephemeral assurances not to reveal news of a pregnancy while it was occurring. Some people think that means, and they conflate that notion with an idea of lifelong anonymity from surrendered sons or daughters, children, which is a completely different concept. Anonymity was not even possible, and there are a few reasons for this. First, it wasn't in the law. End of the story there. Secondly, the placement and surrender forms that birth parents sign, placement when you were placing a child into the care of the system, and surrender when you were terminating your parental rights, not only did not make promises to birth parents, very often birth parents had to promise that they would not interfere. And another great Dr. Samuels, Dr. Elizabeth Samuels, in the University of Baltimore, did great research on this to show that there's never been any paperwork produced to the contrary. Third, as I mentioned before, the court petition process, which had a likelihood of failure, so it's very rare that was an avenue without a solution. And finally, and April will know this, there was never guarantee of an adoption. And if you age out of foster care, you get your birth certificate. So it was not possible to promise anonymity. Once we tell that to legislators, most of them do get on board with what we're doing. So when we're talking about meanings, whose meaning that we're living, the meaning that we often lived as adoptees in terms of that sense of helplessness about we probably won't ever get to know where we come from, was very often rooted in a misunderstanding of a meaning that was not true. It was not true. And now we're going to change that. That's why we're here. And we've been changing that in the press. We've been changing that with legislators. And some states are getting it right, and some states are frankly getting it wrong. Even today, yesterday, I watched a debacle of a hearing in Arizona where I saw a group of legislators, unfortunately, speak from a premise of complete misunderstanding about this issue. And the same thing in Idaho. There's a couple states that are on the way to doing this incorrectly. We've tried to alert them that there's a better understanding on this. But in New York and in Rhode Island and Alabama and in Kansas and Alaska and in Maine and in 9 states, we've got it right. We've got to keep going. So we're gonna win this thing. and win on the meanings.
Well, at least win so that people can get the information, right? That was always really theirs to have.
Basic human right to know where you come from. Basic civil right to have unrestricted access to that document. Some people say, well, now with the DNA, does it really matter? Well, yeah, there's a big difference between being able to get information from DNA and having a civil right to a vital record that was created for the benefit of the person named on that document. And that's an extremely important human and civil rights imperative that cannot be overlooked.
April, talk to us about counterspaces.
So if you would ask me 20 years ago, I'd have been like, get out of my space, right? I was so used to a child welfare all in my space. I really think that the one space that I want us to stay focused on, for me, it was always built about building family and connecting and healing along the way. And you have to do the work, but you can't do the work to heal unless you understand where you come from or who you connect to, why you connect to them, and what's the purpose around the connection. Part of the reason, one of the main reasons, went from a youth advisory board, and then we established several advocates across the states, Foster Care Alumni of America, was that bridge, that connection, that lived experience that just didn't go away because you became an adult. And so it's, what did you do with it? Well, you had more to advocate. So we all launched Foster Care Alumni of America. And we're so used to being told, you either age out at 18 or you age out at 21 or you're adopted and you've achieved permanence. What we wanted to do was connect everybody with a common thread. So Tim could join, Gina could join, Holly could join, even Amanda and Jen, because we had alumni and allies. You didn't have to just be in foster care to belong to this group. You had to have a common thread. And that's what we have here today. So we connected, we had one voice. So you weren't just advocating for those who grew up in child welfare system and lived the rest of their life in child welfare, or for those who returned home. There was even the space of, well, do we allow adopted kids in? I remember that at one of the roundtables in 1999. I was just like, who says that? Do we allow adopted? Why and why? And here was the thing. Well, they found permanency. What story do they still have to tell? Right. And that for me, again, right, was another shifting point for me, right, in my life. Like, since when do we get to say when someone has a story to tell or not to tell? The other question was, do we allow people who've been returned home or found permanency to go back home in? Right. And because they had it, the grass was greener on the other side. So the grass was only horrible for those who stood in the child welfare system. And I'm not being dismissive of that. But for me at that time, I was like, well, we need to connect those who we think had it so great and got adopted and it's the good life. Because remember, I have a sibling that went home and I have a sibling that got adopted. So there wasn't the best of both worlds. And I actually had to learn from my younger brother when I said, Papa, you went home to your father, you lived in Puerto Rico, you connected. And he said, yeah, but I never once got to see holidays and birthdays with you guys. Right. And we forget about those. Right. I used to make our worker celebrate when we would come together one birthday all together. So each year I may have been turning 19, but together as a sibling, we had a sibling birthday because we missed those holidays. We missed those things, those special moments that we take for granted. So connecting was saying there is a bigger story to tell. And when telling that story along that journey, you heal. You go through the healing process. I don't mean the story where you're standing up in front of everybody in tokenism and ripping off that Band-Aid and said, I went through this, this, and this in foster care and this, and this with my biological parents. I went through healing. I had to reclaim a relationship with my biological father in order for him to be a grandfather. And we don't acknowledge that. My baby sister will never be able to reclaim that relationship with her biological father, even with knowing his information, because there was a cutoff and a huge disconnect. So there's differences, right? So she's had to attribute her relationships. For me, I've had 3 fathers, 2 uncles that raised me that at periods in my time in my life became my father. And then when I was an adult, my father was father back because we were able to heal that relationship. Foster care doesn't teach you healing. Adoption doesn't teach you healing. Return home doesn't teach you healing. So I want to be clear on that when people think, oh, you're just going to heal, you're going to be all better, you're going to get adopted, it's permanency, you're great, you're out, you got 2 good parents, you're great. You returned home to a parent, we gave skills, we connected. The reality is we have to do more than that. And we have to be clear that even as adults, we carry that with us through adulthood and parenting and relationships. And if we don't address those as we are in the child welfare system, whether we're achieving permanency, whatever mechanism it is, we will have to address them as adults. Some system will have to address them. Some relationship will have to address them. Whether we trust that relationships are long lasting, and how do we bring that in the fold? If a system is not set up for us to have lifelong connections, how are we really going to adapt and develop those realistically? And I'm just being as honest and as possible. We all have our own walls that we put up for whatever reason in our life that has allowed us to survive. But what are the walls that need to be teared down to allow us to thrive? If you ask me, we need to work on decolonizing our child welfare system. If you ask me, we need to abolish our child welfare system, to blow it up. And I'm not just thinking pie in the sky that there are cases and situations in which children do need to be removed. But when I think about the premise in which I was removed from my parents, my mother struggled with mental illness. Back in 1983, we had to deal with what that meant. And the only reason why my sister was removed in 1993 was because of a famous case then around a mother who was mentally ill and got her children back and murdered one of them. And so rather than putting in places or seeing the work what families have done, we always want to see the families as the bad person, the villain. We never, and that's why we're closed off. That's why we have all these questions around why should we want to reconnect you, Tim and Gina and Holly, to your families? They were the bad people in the first place. But were they really in most cases? What could we or should we have been doing to ensure? And I know every case is different. And just as I advocate for siblings to stay connected or to be able to reconnect with your siblings, I also know there are cases in which there is no connection. But if we don't build upon and stress the importance of that relationship, it's never going to be important. It's just going to be another day. When I work with my young people today, holidays, they're just another day. Relationships, it's just another moment. High school, I get out of it. College, I get out of it. But the reality is, what are we really doing to keep our families connected? And this bigger piece, what we're seeing in child welfare now, is that you either come out that you grew up in child welfare, were adopted, you were returned home in some space, and you live with a double-edged sword. Well, what happened to you? What's wrong with you? Not what's right with you, right? You have to be able to say, I am educated so-and-so for someone to even acknowledge to think that something's right with you. And that's not the case. So meaning making, knowledge, and connections, they're all key, no matter what bucket you tip over.
Yeah. So powerful, April. Yeah. Let's burn down what does not serve anyone anymore. And I think, I'll just let you all make one kind of closing comment, and then I'll open up for the Q&A, which we have a number there, so we can continue a dialogue. But there are so many walls that our system has created. So it's like you get adopted, the walls there, we don't see you anymore. You go back to your family, we don't see you anymore. We have walls around foster care, adoption, child welfare adoption, international adoption, when really we're all in the same pool of experiences. And what could happen if we brought all those walls down, and again, then looked at the kids throughout their whole entire life. So with that question I have for you all, and then whatever kind of final wrap-up point you'd like to make, from your perspective as an adult, what is something that could be so helpful for that young person who will be you someday? So, who wants to jump in? Putting you all
I don't know if I want to go first on that. I think. Who's
Yeah.
going? Oh, I'll go.
Oh, go, Tim.
It's actually probably a relatively simple question for me. I think first off, there's just a tremendous amount of a sense of cloud nine and joy and happiness as we continue to celebrate the restoration of unrestricted access to original birth certificates to adult adoptees here in New York, in my state. For that to happen in my lifetime, and for people like Florence Anna Fisher, who started our movement in 1971, to share in that and be able to tell her about that and share it with her and share it with my fellow advocates, people like Jennifer Sorrow in the state, people like Bert Hirsch, our allied advocates, NIARC, everybody, has been a tremendous thing. And it's one thing to be a beneficiary and a stakeholder in a law, and there's something quite special about being able to actualize as an adopted person in helping to do that. It's been a tremendous honor and probably the highest privilege in my life to do that. As far as what I would say to someone who's younger or not maybe even alive yet, I would say my goal would be that you never have to feel that sense of otherness, that sense of frustration and incredulity with a system that for a very long time, over 80 years, refused to acknowledge you as a full citizen. You are, and remember that as much as you may be tempted to take it for granted that you have that right now, you are a part of making sure that we protect that right. I've learned very quickly in New York that my role has gone from the getter of the restoration of the rights to the guardian to make sure no one even thinks about touching it. Don't even dream. So I'm looking forward to all of you adoptees who are there now younger and have not been born yet. Make sure that this right is always protected, and I will be very, very proud of you.
Thank you, Tim. Gina or April?
I guess I'll go. I would just say, yeah, there's a lot swirling around in my head that Tim and April said that I'll just let stay out there, but I appreciate all of the thoughts of what you both have added to this conversation. It's so really important. I guess I would say to a younger self, I think it's easy, whether you're adopted or you've aged out or you're gonna age out or you've gotten returned 7 times and came back in or whatever the situation is, it can feel like you're the only one, and that that people don't get you, which is partly true. So I don't want to dismiss that feeling, but I would hope that we do a better job of reaching out our tentacles to let people know, actually, it's not, there are lots of people who really can get what you're feeling, in a deep and personal way. And that the more you make use of, like April was talking about, family building, and that can look all kinds of different ways for different people. April, your family is lucky to have you. And not everybody has people who are fighting to be connected to them. And so, but other people can be that. And so how do we be a better community for each other, those of us who are older, and help people know that, we're a community too. Like, it's a community. There are these existing communities, but then there's also the community of us who have had displacements and had 2 and 7 and 20 families and 2 and 7 and 20 moms and all of that. And that is a thing, and that is an experience, and it's a legitimate kind of way to have moved through the world. And those of us who share that by whatever pathway can be part of that community for each other. And I hope that we continue to find ways to reach out and to do that, and to know that they're not alone.
Knowing you're not alone really lifts the burden. April?
I actually was going to start with what Gina had closed with. You're not alone, right? As my colleagues have said. And I think it's important you just keep saying that. The reality is that when someone asks me, how many sisters do you have? I have to be like, oh, how many siblings do you have? I have to be like, biologically, I have 3, but I have actually 17 sisters and 13 brothers, right? And they all live in different states, and it all depends on, who you ask. At one point, I had my son ask me, was he adopted? Because it was different walks of life, races, culture that said, they were his nephew, right? That he was their nephew, and they were their aunts, they were uncles, and I think that it really is about embracing who you are, standing in your authentic self, understanding that you're going to continue to go through things. And this is only building, and I don't want to say this is making you stronger, it's building you to be resilient, but it is presenting you with a path for healing. You got to do the work, even when you don't want to do the work. The moments of what it means to breathe, all of those things that we take for granted as we're going through the systems, those little moments, and thank the people and connect with the people where they're alive when you have the moments. Ensure that you're fighting the good fight, because we need you as a doctor, a lawyer. We need you as a teacher, an advocate. We need you as a social worker, an educator. We need you as the person who is at the grocery store. And the reason why I say we need you is because we understand what it's like to be in those shoes. We know what it's like to go to the social worker's office or to the school counselor and having to, or go to gym or whatever it is, and show up and be able to explain, this is not my family, or I was adopted, or this is now my second home. And what it means to receive someone who understands where we come from. So be proud, live with purpose, because it's not a stigma. It's not a bad thing that you grew up in foster care, or that you were adopted, or that you returned home. It's a blessing that you have this experience to be able to give back, to pull forward. No, I'm not saying like, oh, we all need to end up in the child welfare system. That's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm really saying is that we have to keep thinking that we're not the problem. There's nothing wrong with us. We're good. The fights for legislations, the changes that we'll make, the articles, the books, the stories. I know more authors that grew up in the child welfare system and that were adopted, and I can proudly say, and I get just as excited to get their autograph, that I know that are just regular old authors out there. To me, those are the ones I want to read. There's a story to tell. Live your story and be unapologetically not afraid to tell it.
Bravo. Okay, I'm going to switch to some of the questions from our audience. One individual says that I'm of a mixed Asian race, but mostly Chinese. I appear Asian externally, but feel culturally white internally. I have white parents. Is it okay for me to say I have a mixed identity, or is that mislabeling?
I don't know. That seems pretty mixed to me. I mean, I guess, so there's the snotty answer that I will give, and then I'll be more serious. Well, you can call yourself whatever you choose to call yourself that feels, genuine to how you want yourself to be read and understood. And know that other people will do whatever they're going to do and accept, they're going to do what they're going to do. But I think that's a hard thing. It's the serious answer is, I think for all people who are adopted across race, especially, it's one thing, like for myself, I am mixed race. So whether I got adopted or not, I would have had a white mom. And so that's a different path of my understanding my mixedness than, for example, my sister, who is not mixed and is Black. What does it mean for her to feel mixed, But I think that's for you to make a decision about how does that term feel for you? And does that seem like it conveys how you feel? And I love that you make a distinction about culture, like we can have I think of myself as having family anchors in a lot of cultures. I don't necessarily racially identify, because that's not my own background racially, but culturally, absolutely. And so to get good at figuring out language that allows you to honor your complexity and how you want to be seen in the world. And at the end of the day, that really is for you to wrestle with and reconcile, even when people may or may not respect your choices in labeling. But I don't know, do other people want to weigh in on that at all?
I would just say that despite what I was mentioning earlier about people approaching me about my ethnicity when I was young, I know that I'm Caucasian. I have a mixture of Hungarian background and Italian and a few other things. And all my life, I always felt a kind of affinity about being Italian, and located my birth mom, and she's Italian. And so, I feel very culturally connected to that to a certain extent, even though there's a larger percentage of my actual genetic background that's Hungarian than Italian, but I think I'm about 35% Italian, 50% Hungarian. So I suppose I don't spend all of my time thinking about it, but I think we have to, as Gina says, kind of honor what we feel is propelling us towards a sense of identity and wholeness. And hopefully from that, others will be able to respect it. We can't really expect that they will, but we can do that for ourselves. And I think the more we do that for ourselves, the more the others will, the ones who really love us and cherish us will honor that.
Yeah. Glenn Morey asks, what is the most important counter message for the broadly accepted social narratives about adoption, rescue, lucky, chosen? What is the most important specific message, not just generally like adoption is complex? I have one, which it came from a conversation with you, April, is that adoption means more, that it means more family, more losses, maybe more traumas, but also more love. And I think that if we embrace the more, which embeds all the complexities of it, we would actually get at the truth of what adoption can provide. And if child welfare system saw itself as part of the family, not the one that's just like get you in, get you out, get you in, get you out. It was designed much more transactional than like a family. That could be part of the crumbling down of the old structure. April, what do you have any thought?
I would just briefly reiterate what I said earlier about that when people learn that there's a circumstance of surrender and a circumstance of adoption, and they see that when people who are adopted persons are looking into their past, they're not making a commentary necessarily about adoption, but they're trying to reconcile surrender and all the things that come with it. When someone who's in foster care, and April, you can please tell me where I go too far afield here, is attempting to reconcile their attitudes about adoption because they have siblings that have had different experiences. That's not necessarily an inherent statement about being a foster care youth, but it's a process of trying to reconcile those varieties.
I think it's on. Thank you, Tim and Holly. Yeah, I really do agree with what you're saying. And to take it a step further is oftentimes we forget as a system about those that have been adopted or those that have returned home and just assume that the switch was turned on for them and everything is great. We also forget about those who are achieving, the high achievers in foster care that are still in the system and they're getting straight A's and they're doing really good. Again, that the switch is turned on. And what we don't really come back to is the work that needs to get done to support them. And no, you haven't made it because you got adopted. No, you haven't made it because you aged out. You didn't make it because you returned home, right? It's a part of life. It was one of your transitions. And everyone at each of those, what I call the weaves that we weave together, they need the support. They need the connection. What we think is making it, there's so much behind that curtain. Think of the Wizard of Oz. Pull back the curtain and find out who's really there.
I think we have time only for one more, and I'll just let folks know that we will download the questions, and if our speakers can respond to them, we will. later. One person, anonymous, said, I understand and appreciate the panelist perspective. However, as a social work for child welfare, it's hard to see beyond the family they were in, because it may not be in the best interest of the child, so that they are able to move beyond their trauma, etc.
Mm. Yeah, Holly, you had said something earlier, and now I don't even remember what it was, but this is a nice excuse for me to say what I was going to say to something you said earlier that I don't remember what it was. Is that I think, having been a caseworker myself, I think what ends up happening is we have a very short-term, immediate view of what's in the best interest, and I think that we don't have to pathologize why that is. That it comes because you have to, as a caseworker, make a decision within a very specific amount of time about where a kid is going to live and where they're going to be. But I think we oftentimes conflate who's going to raise that child, where that child's going to be today, because they need a place to sleep and someone to take care of them and take them to school and all that kind of stuff. And the person who is their biological parent or parents may not be that person right now today. But that doesn't mean forever that biological parent can have no purpose or role ever in that child's life. And I think, our systems are so set up as risk averse and immediate and short term. And so we make these decisions with that kind of, purpose in mind, which makes sense. But we could also be thinking about how do we do those things and leave doors open so that as that child is growing up, who knows, people change, who knows where that birth family is going to be, or where that birth mom, birth dad, uncle, aunt, grandma, grandpa, auntie, cousins, all that whole thing. Who knows where that's going to be? So I think it's just a false sort of dichotomy that we create as a system, that just because we place a child in a home that makes sense, that's where they maybe even really should be, that the biological family parent can't do it for a whole variety of reasons. But that doesn't mean that then we just and sever everything forever. And so I think I think I'd like us to loosen a little bit and be a little more flexible in thinking through short-term and long-term needs, and have a way of practicing and engaging people, families, communities from that sort of long and short-term perspective.
And I would say, thank you for that, Gina. And I'll say this again, my parents were not able to parent, but they became the best grandparents.
Yeah.
And we often go into times thinking that because you couldn't resolve or keep them in the homes of their parents, that you couldn't keep them in the homes with their relatives. And that's not always the case. We like to think that how could a relative allow this to happen? So then we don't think about the whole family. And I really want to charge us to think about the whole family before we move out and about. And again, there's going to be times when we're not able to utilize the whole family. But I came from a family of 17, 18 different aunts and uncles. And so we need to continue to think about the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the theme of this conference has been adopted adults connections over generations. And I think part of what we were trying to elevate through these different sessions has been that it is that child growing up and intergenerationally. And I love your points, April, about maybe couldn't be a great dad, but could be a great grandfather. And that is that longer view of what are we setting people up for. And back to Gina's slide where she showed, at different ages and stages, and that some of these things have become more important to adoptees, not when they are children, but when they are grown-ups. And so then what can we do to ensure that the system is designed so that they can have what they need as adults as well. With that, I just wanted to wrap up our launch session for the spring. We will be having another session that's going to be focused on genetic testing for health as well as for search. And then our final session will be in May, looking at writing as a tool for healing and authoring. So thank you, Gina, Tim, and April for the generosity of your time and knowledge and wisdom. And thank you all to our participants for hanging in here, listening in, and being a part of our conversation tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to express my sincerest thanks to Gina and Tim and April and Holly for this important and insightful conversation about the ways in which adult adoptees can both author and authorize their own life stories. My name is Hal Grodevant, and I direct the Rudd Adoption Research Program at UMass Amherst. This session adds in such critical ways to our series on how adoption is experienced during adulthood. You've just heard from 4 people whose adoption stories and life trajectories are quite different, but they're all tied together by the common core experience of being adopted and making meaning of that in their lives. Beyond their personal journeys, they're all contributing in really important ways to broader well-being in the adoption community, which is such a significant gift from them. I'd just like to underscore a few points that the speakers made, ideas that we really need to incorporate more actively into our adoption research and practice and policy. First, adoption really requires us to rethink what family means, and in particular, to realize that current practice too often involves cutting off relationships rather than building on and adding to existing ones. All of the speakers addressed how we can do a better job of thinking about adoption in terms of both and rather than either or. Second, there's an extensive adoption community which brings adopted persons together despite their varied individual adoption stories. The community can provide a profound source of connection and support, which you can certainly see through each of the stories that our speakers presented. It's not hard to find if you look for it, and mentors like today's panelists are more than happy to assist in that process. And third, as the panelists said, live your story with a sense of purpose and don't be apologetic about it. These are powerful messages all around. Thank you all so much. This video will continue to be available on demand at no charge through our Rudd Adoption YouTube channel, thanks to the generosity of our speakers and our sponsors. You can also find us through our Facebook page and website. We hope that you will share our series through your own social media networks as well. We have 2 more presentations planned for the first half of 2021, continuing our discussion of navigating adulthood as adoptees. Please stay tuned. We'll be posting notification of all these events on our Facebook page for the Rudd Adoption Research Program and on our Rudd website. If you'd like to make sure you're on our mailing list, please send an email to adoption@psych.umass.edu. For now, thanks once again to our amazing panelists today, and we all thank you for joining us.